Hey there, Social Studies 20. We're talking about internationalism again today. I'm going to look at the different kinds of international, liberal, hegemonic, revolutionary. And I know we've talked about those a bit already in theory. What we'll take a look at today is maybe applying some specific examples to those terms to just give you a better understanding of internationalism and some specifics that you can think about and talk about. So, as we've already learned, liberal internationalism is about achieving, uh, you want cooperation, global interaction among countries on an equal level at equal footing. So, liberal internationalism would involve nations working together through cooperation without any one nation dominating the other nations, or any two nations dominating all of the other nations, which is kind of always what seems to happen. But theoretical liberal internationalism would mean that nations are all equal. No one nation is better or worse than any of the others. A couple of key terms you need to think about too at this point. We can often study this kind of internationalism by examining IGOs and NGOs. I know they're weird terms, I didn't make them up. An IGO is an international government organization. So an IGO is an international government organization that basically is the cooperation among a few governments of the world. The UN is a great example of an IGO, an international government organization. Governments pool their resources, they work together, and they try to accomplish something, whatever that might be. The other brand of organization we'll look at today is INGOs, international non-governmental organization. I don't know why they thought of this terminology. I don't know what they were thinking. It's confusing, but an INGO is a non-governmental organization. And so a good example of that would be maybe the International Red Cross. Red Cross, it's a great example of a non-governmental organization um, uh, but it can accomplish a lot of good things. So if there is ever a disaster, a war, as you learned in Rwanda, a genocide, an ethnic cleansing, the Red Cross is usually one of the first organizations on scene to help people. It is there for humanitarian crisis of all kinds. It's a non-governmental organization. It's independent from governments. So Red Cross gets a lot of its funding, the bulk of its funding, through donations. A Red Cross drive, a food bank, whatever it might be. The Red Cross gets its resources from donations and goodwill of people. And I'm sure you've seen the Red Cross in TV, movies, and so on. Famous, famous non-governmental organization. Other examples might be, I was just thinking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I know that, we're living in the midst of this COVID crisis. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, upon hearing of the COVID crisis back in the new year, built three separate um, centers for disease control, each of them independently trying to develop a vaccine for coronavirus. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gets its money, well, from Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, but also donations and so on. But it's not run by a government. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is independent from governments, so it needs to get resources on its own. Great example of an international non-governmental organization. Another one might be the Carter Center. The Carter Center was founded for Jimmy Carter, previous American president back in the 1970s, and it is also a famous non-governmental organization that raises money on its own and fights global problems on its own too. The one that comes to mind that you'll learn about later, probably tomorrow, is the guinea worm. Guinea worm is a disease that spreads through contaminated drinking water. It is literally a worm growing in your body, and over time, it can grow up to 3 feet long, and it tries to burrow its way outside of your leg, and it's very painful and debilitating. It is the Carter Center that is vowed to eradicate the guinea worm, and they're getting very, very close. I think they're down to just over 100 cases of it. But that's an example of two different ways of establishing liberal internationalism. A government organization like the UN, like the World Health Organization, or a non-governmental organization like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Red Cross, and so on. The advantage of an INGO, the non-governmental organization, advantages include they're usually very not grassroots, but they begin from the ground up. They don't try to do things en masse on a big scale, but rather an INGO will focus on small things, small groups of people, small populations, and they will give what is known as micro assistance. So very small amounts of aid to just a few people. And what we find is that aid is very, 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 very effective. I know that a good form of aid I had read about a few years back, microaid, was going to an impoverished village, wherever it might be, and giving one family one goat and giving another family one goat. And what that goat does is that that farmer can now, that rancher can lend his goat out, he can rent his goat out to breed, to control grass and so on. And from that one small micro loan, that farmer can become self-sufficient and lift he and his family from poverty. Um, the other advantage of INGOs is that they can communicate from top levels of government right down to the neighborhood. What you'll learn is that international government organizations like the UN, in some cases, they're just too big. They're too big and they lose their effectiveness, and that their goals are too big, they're too vast, they're not focused. And what you learn in life as you go through adulthood is that the world is basically a big, what they call the bureaucracy, one level after the other level after the other level. And what I mean by that is that in a bureaucracy, it's really hard to get things done because there's so many different layers of this organization at work that oftentimes they all get in their own way and nothing gets done. And that is one critique of the UN and international government organizations. They're too big, they're not as effective. And that is the beauty of the non-government organization. They're small, they're very focused, they might be more motivated, and they can maybe get more things done. Disadvantages, though, that go along with the non-government organizations, because they're not run by governments, they have smaller budgets. Because they rely strictly on donations and goodwill, they don't have the budget that maybe the UN would have, that maybe the WHO would have. And as well, they don't have a military force. So whereas the UN can go in and stop a genocide or an ethnic cleansing, a non-government organization can't do that because they don't have the military force. So Bill Gates might be well motivated to stop an ethnic cleansing or a civil war, but they don't have a standing army. They don't have a military force to go in and actually do that. I hope you understand a bit the difference between an IGO and an INGO. One's big, one's little, and they vary in terms of effectiveness. Next thing we'll talk about here today, we'll continue with liberal internationalism. Here's the critique of the IGOs, the International Government Organization. So here's what one could say is wrong with them. Um, they're very political. They do a lot of things for profit. So to understand how the IGOs might fail from time to time, think about the case study we just looked at in terms of Rwanda. Um, the UN, although down the road they were able to bring the genocide to a halt, they were absent for the first couple of months altogether, because the UN was maybe too big, it was too involved, it was too political. Um, the French wouldn't work with the Russians and vice versa, and the Americans wouldn't work with whoever during that crisis. So that just shows you that the IGOs might be too big. Yes, they have a huge budget. Yes, they've got the military force in terms of advantages, but they have trouble getting things done. They have trouble taking action because countries of the UN all want different things. They're motivated by different things, and they can use that veto to stop things from happening. So, huge budget, yes. Um, they might have a military force in terms of the UN and being an IGO, but quite often they can't get out of their own way. They do things for profit, they're politically motivated, they quite often do things for the wrong reasons, and sometimes they don't do them, and that might be the failure of the IGO. More and more, it looks like INGOs are going to be more effective than your IGOs for reasons I think that we just talked about. All right, on to hegemonic internationalism. We won't spend much time on this, but we'll spend a bit of time on this. As we learned, hegemonic internationalism is when one country or a couple of countries will dominate all of the other countries on an international scale. To have hegemony means to have dominance. So, hegemonic internationalism is that, yes, you're doing things to push things along internationally, but one or two countries dominate all the others. And a good example would be the World Trade Organization, as you probably learned back in 10-1 or 10-2. The WTO is kind of the international agency that encourages free trade, that persuades nations to get rid of their trade barriers, tariffs, and so on, and embrace free trade. A lot of money has been made because of the WTO. They've liberated trade, they've promoted free trade, they made a lot of countries rich. They've even made poor countries richer than they were before. But the World Trade Organization might have a downfall, and that downfall would be it's an example of hegemonic internationalism. And what I mean by that is that the world's wealthiest countries, America, China, Russia, and so on, dominate the World Trade Organization. And they always seem to get their way with the World Trade Organization because these countries are so dominant economically and politically too, I guess. By the way, the WTO is another example of an international government organization. And so is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was a fund, a bank created to help poor countries borrow money. The International Monetary Fund was, and it's dominated again by the wealthiest nations on earth. And what usually happens is, yes, these countries do promote economic internationalism, but it's always in their benefit. It always probably favors the rich countries more than it does the poor countries. And that could be a criticism of the WTO and the IMF. And for sure, it's a criticism of hegemonic internationalism. Rich countries advancing policy on behalf of the poor countries. That little blurb at the bottom just talks about how, yes, you know, countries do pursue internationalism from an economic standpoint, but it's always with strings attached. And by that, I mean, sure, America will loan a poor country money as part of the IMF, but there are strings attached that go with that. Those countries have to agree to what are known as structural adjustments. Basically, they've got to spend less on education and healthcare to pay back the loan. That's a structural adjustment. They need to privatize their economies more to embrace capitalism. Otherwise, they don't get the loan from the IMF. And they may have to invoke what are known as austerity measures. Austerity measures means you cut back on local spending and infrastructure. You spend less on roads, on healthcare, on medicine, so you can pay back the loan that you got from the International Monetary Fund. Again, that's something from grade 10, but the IMF is basically just a pool of money that is there on donations from rich countries, and they will loan that money to poor countries, but only with these strings attached. And so you wonder, is it really doing things in the spirit of internationalism, or is it just, wealthy, dominant economies dominating the other economies even more? And that would be your hegemonic internationalism. Finally, the last thing we'll look at here today is revolutionary internationalism. And we studied this already, but revolutionary internationalism usually involves overthrowing a dictator or a regime and implementing a democracy. You might even call it democratization. So, revolutionary internationalism is another form of internationalism where outside agencies, outside force will bring about change internally in another country. And so if there's a country on earth living under a horrible dictatorship, Other countries will help democratize that country. And that is revolutionary internationalism. Really good example would be Afghanistan. I don't know if you know this, but back in the 1990s and early 2000s, Afghanistan was governed by a group called the Taliban. We would call them terrorists. Other people might call them Islamic fundamentalists, yet others would call them freedom fighters. The Taliban were very authoritarian, repressive, um, religious dictatorship or a theocracy. They were a dictatorial regime. Under the Taliban, girls couldn't go to school. Under the Taliban, girls couldn't have jobs and have professional positions like teaching and engineering and so on. Under the Taliban, there were a series of repressive measures. There was no free speech, etc., etc. So revolutionary internationalism occurred when America and other UN nations invaded Afghanistan in 2001, toppled the Taliban from power, and democratized Afghanistan. That would be revolutionary internationalism. But the caveat, the key, is that it can really only happen um, with the involvement of an outside country, a third party. So you've got that dictator oppressing his population. You need a country to come from the outside to topple that dictator. Otherwise, it's probably never going to happen. Afghanistan was probably never going to get rid of the Taliban without that external force of the UN, America, and so on to democratize Afghanistan. That is revolutionary internationalism. I've got another example there in front of you, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine of 2004. Ah, yeah, sure, I'll quickly cover this one. Um, Ukraine in 2004 in the fall was having a federal nationwide election. And the two front runners were um, Yushkevich versus Yushchenko. Yushchenko was the favorite to win the election. Everyone expected him to win, but there was widespread election tampering in the days and weeks leading up to the election. Um, Corruption at one point, Yushchenko himself was poisoned by his rival. There were bullying and voter intimidation. Some people voted multiple times for Uvekich. Anyway, in the end, even though the election was a sham, the world stepped in. Freedom House, Democracy Watch agencies stepped in, and these are non-government agencies, Freedom House, Democracy Watch, etc. They went into Ukraine and they monitored and supervised a new election that in this case was fair, upfront, and honest. And the guy that should have won in the end did win. Yushchenko won that election. In the previous election, Yushchenko's rival won, but everyone knew that it was a joke and a sham, and it was voter intimidation, etc., etc. The people of Ukraine protested. There was a virtual revolution, and the government that won by cheating basically had to call a new election. And with the help of Freedom House, Democracy Watch, and so on, the right guy won the next election. And Ukraine finally got its democracy. But there you go again. That is revolutionary internationalism. Yeah, a third party coming in, supervising the election, making sure it's honest, and making sure that the right person wins. The guy that should win does win. By the way, Freedom House and Democracy Watch are non-governmental organizations. Okay, that should do it for that part of the lesson. The next section involves you watching some quick short videos on YouTube. So to tee up this part of the lesson, um, I want to make sure we're careful about evaluating the UN. If all we ever used to evaluate the UN was the disaster in Rwanda and things like that, we probably wouldn't be giving the UN a fair shake and a fair chance. And in truth, the UN has dropped the ball a lot in terms of ethnic cleansings, genocide, civil war, and so on. Yeah, that is true. The UN's dropped the ball a lot and it didn't do what it was supposed to do. But we got to be careful. The UN does some things really, really, really well. And so by understanding and recognizing again that the WHO is Here we go in. By understanding that the World Health Organization is an agency of the UN, we can give the UN a fair shake at evaluating the effectiveness of the UN. So the World Health Organization is an agency of the UN. It is funded by the UN. It runs at the hand of the UN, and it actually hasn't done a bad job in terms of meeting the goals of the United Nations. So if we only ever used civil war, ethnic cleansing, and genocide to judge the UN, we would probably give the UN a failing grade. However, the UN has done a very good job through the World Health Organization in terms of disease control. And so what we're going to look at in this part of the lesson is the effectiveness of the WHO in eradicating four diseases that have afflicted mankind in some cases for thousands of years. Um, I'm not doing this because of the COVID-19 crisis. This was always part of the course and always going to be part of the lesson. But as you learn about these four diseases and how deadly they have been and are to people today, be thinking of COVID-19 and be comparing it to COVID-19 based on these big forest comparisons and be thinking about all the attention COVID-19 is getting. Is it getting too much? Is it not getting enough? And I'll leave that up to you. But very quickly, smallpox has been around for thousands of years. It has killed millions of people worldwide. And you're going to watch a video on smallpox and the eradication of smallpox. The good news is it's a disease that has been eradicated. It's had an inoculation for decades now. Your parents probably have a smallpox inoculation scar on their shoulder. I know that I have it. I'm looking at it right now. I've got a smallpox inoculation scar on my left shoulder. You probably don't have one. Well, you wouldn't have one because the disease has since been eradicated. We don't need one anymore. But smallpox is responsible for depopulating, by and large, North and South America. It killed upwards of probably 19 million First Nations peoples. That's how deadly that disease was. Millions more have died worldwide over the years in Europe and Africa and so on. Smallpox, deadly, deadly infectious disease that the World Health Organization has since eradicated. Malaria is the second one I'd like you to take a look at. Again, it's not a well-known disease, especially in the Western Hemisphere, because by and large we're not affected by it in terms of latitude and where we are. But malaria is carried by mosquitoes. It is a virus carried by a mosquito that kills and has killed millions of people. In fact, in some places of the world, they worry more about malaria for sure, more than they are about COVID-19. Malaria will kill more people this year than COVID-19 will. It has not yet been eradicated, but the WHO has done a lot to mitigate the number of people that die and are affected by malaria. Other one you're going to look at is polio. Polio an infectious disease that over time affects your spinal cord and can paralyze you. A lot of famous people have been stricken by polio. President Roosevelt was stricken by polio as a child. It has not yet been eradicated, but I think they're on the verge. They're on the eve of eradicating polio. And again, this is driven by the WHO, the World Health Organization. And the last one is guinea worm. And I took this one just because it's, again, another really unknown disease. But in this case, it's not being attacked by the WHO. This one is being attacked by the Carter Center. So here's an example of the effectiveness of an international non-governmental organization in combating a disease that, again, it's passed along through contaminated drinking water. It's a horrible disease to get. We might not get to guinea worm today because it's a little longer. We might save that one till tomorrow. And so I think what we'll go after today, and I'll put all these instructions into D2L on the calendar. I think we'll go after smallpox, malaria, and polio. And we're going to save guinea worm for tomorrow as an example of the effectiveness of a non-governmental organization. Um, Hope you learned something today. I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you. I feel like I'm really rushing you, which I guess I am. I mean, this is related issue 3. It's a unit unto itself that really we need at least a month to examine. But I mean, of course, we can't with the COVID lockdown. I could only get about 3 weeks in. My plan was that I knew I was never going to finish the whole course. There's no way we could with just 3 hours a week. So my plan all along was, you know what? We're going to do a really thorough, effective job with related issue number 2, ultranationalism. And we did. I taught you everything we were ever going to learn in class anyway, just in a different way. But I knew in that giving you the full version, the unabridged version of related issue number 2, I knew I would not have time to do more than scratch or make a dent in related issue number 3. And that to me, it made more sense to do one thing all in than do a whole bunch of things and just scratch the surface. Related issue 2 will really help you next year in 30-1 more so than related issue 3 internationalism was going to. That's why I did that. And I think that was a smart call. That's to your benefit. But we've got another couple of weeks. We'll keep learning. We'll learn a bit more about internationalism. But I understand if you feel overwhelmed with all that terminology I threw at you. Yeah, I was going fast. I had to. I have no choice. And if you're confused, if you're worried, well, please email me and I can straighten it out. I'm sure it's not that bad. Okay, really good job. Thanks for listening today. Check D2L, check the calendar for some further instructions on these things.